Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, June 13th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the city of New York and the mayoral election that all eyes on the country are looking at as the next big election set to take place on June 24th. Right around the corner, a Democratic primary that is likely to dictate who will eventually win the New York City mayoral election and lead the nation's largest city for the next 4 years. Now, last night there was, yet again, another New York City debate. A debate amongst the Democratic candidates at which we saw Andrew Cuomo, the former governor of New York, and Zohran Mamdani, who is the second place candidate right now in the city of New York in the mayoral election, facing off against each other and really in a fiery way. Now, for the first time in a very long time, the New York City mayoral election is looking like it's actually a lot closer than it had started off, with Andrew Cuomo with a deafening lead in the early stages of this race. I talked about it a little bit earlier on last week. I talked about how the race was certainly tightening, but now today we saw, yesterday really, the first poll released from Public Policy Polling showing that Mamdani now leading in his first poll of the cycle in a head-to-head race against Andrew Cuomo. Now, don't get me wrong, I do believe that Andrew Cuomo today stands to be the favorite in the New York City mayoral election. It's an election that he has high name ID, high visibility, and right now New York very clearly is looking for a different direction than Eric Adams. Now, does that direction necessarily mean that New York City voters, Democratic primary voters in specific, want it to be Andrew Cuomo? Not necessarily. It also doesn't mean that they necessarily want it to be Zohran Mamdani either, right? When we're looking at the Democratic primary, what we're finding is that this is a much more Democratic and left-leaning electorate. It's one that does hold the overwhelming majority of the city delegation. But what we need to understand is that what you are competing for in this Democratic primary might look very different than what you might be competing for on a more national stage, on a more statewide stage in New York, even as a Democratic state, compared to what you might be seeing in this Democratic primary, which is why this primary largely has been a primary talking about housing, a primary talking about Andrew Cuomo's scandals, right? Talking about things that might not necessarily be as mainstream in a general election, but certainly do matter to this portion of the electorate, a portion of the electorate that 4 years ago elected Eric Adams to be the next mayor of the city of New York. And now many of these voters seemingly regret their decision. His approval rating is at a very big low point at this point. He's even switched political parties, running as an independent. So you will find that it is very often that many of the politicians that come out of New York City often find themselves disgraced, often find themselves disliked by their constituents. Eric Adams is no different. Now, leading into the next 4 years, talking about a vision, there actually are some pretty substantive differences between Andrew Cuomo and Zohran Mamdani. For many people, and the way we largely do see these races, is a more center-left and a more progressive left. Zohran Mamdani, who has been associated with the Democratic Socialists of America and a much more left-wing faction of the New York Democratic Party, in large contrast with Andrew Cuomo, who at one point in time was heralded as a potential presidential election figure, someone who was more middle of the road, someone who was more, I guess, bipartisan, as we saw in terms of his court appointments and the way that he interacted with New York gerrymanders and the state legislature, all these different things, right? All of these different conversation points that were relevant to Cuomo being someone who was seen as a bit more towards the center. And so seeing these two candidates face off against each other, you will find that there are centrist and progressive factions right now of the New York City mayoral election, but only two candidates really stand to be in a position where they could actually win. And that is the same two that we've been talking about this entire time. And the polling really does show that. What we find is that, just generally speaking, in the polls, Andrew Cuomo maintains a lead. In the first round of voting, the plurality of voters prefer Andrew Cuomo to be the next mayor of New York. What we do find that is more interesting is that in the final round, in the head-to-head, the races often narrow up. What we saw was that public policy polling shows that Mamdani defeats Andrew Cuomo, but in a multi-way race. They don't poll the final rounds, but in many of the final round races, the lead for Cuomo does in fact narrow. But it doesn't narrow enough that it makes Mamdani the winner. After all, Andrew Cuomo still stands to be the frontrunner in this race, but it has certainly tightened over time. When the data was first coming out, Andrew Cuomo was the clear and consistent frontrunner. At different points in time, polling at nearly 50% or above 50%, eliminating the need for any type of ranked choice voting. But as the race continued, Andrew Cuomo went from leading by 27, 28, 30, and in final round polls, 32, 40, 28, down to 12, 9, 2, and 12 most recently, and losing in his first poll that we've seen of the cycle. And I think that really goes to show that what we've seen evolve in New York City is that although Andrew Cuomo started out with what was largely seen as an insurmountable lead, was eventually cracked down upon. Now, Cuomo, again, need to reiterate this countlessly because I think we often lose the plot when talking about what a surge means versus what frontrunner status means. Andrew Cuomo will still likely win the New York City mayoral election. And I think that many Democrats in the city of New York who are voting for Mamdani and voting for other candidates here really do not want that to be the case, as do many of the other candidates not want that to be the case. But that is where we are right now in terms of current polling. And what you'll find is that now there are all these conversations about cross endorsements. Does it make sense for the progressive faction to shore up their support? I thought a lot of people feel very much that shoring up the base and shoring up support in a Democratic primary often does lend itself to outsider candidates, non-traditional, more progressive, more left-wing candidates to actually win in races. Because when you think about the way that vote splitting works, although there is ranked choice voting, if your voters don't have a clear direction as to who to go to, you end up with an election like you saw in 2021, where very clearly, when you saw people like Maya Wiley, who received the endorsement of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and many progressive members of the New York delegation, you'll find that a lot of those voters did not know who to rank next, or if they did, it wasn't clear cut. What we're now seeing is that people are endorsing ranked ballots. And in many of these cases, if they're not ranking Andrew Cuomo, they're ranking everybody besides Andrew Cuomo. It's a universal last choice. It seems to be this massive push amongst the other candidates to say anybody but Cuomo. It wasn't necessarily the exact same thing back in 2021 with Eric Adams. You saw Hakeem Jeffries even ranked Eric Adams back then because 4 years ago, the perception was different. Eric Adams, although, again, the more centrist, more moderate Democrat, certainly the one who was running, narrowly edged by. Why? Because support from Maya Wiley ended up going to Eric Adams. Support from Andrew Yang ended up going to Eric Adams because there was no, seemingly, universal last choice. And so that ultimately ended up with Eric Adams winning by less than a percentage point. Catherine Garcia, who was also seen as a more progressive alternative to Eric Adams, ended up losing again because of this lack of consistent and clear coalition building in the ranked choice voting environment. That's what Democrats seemingly are trying to do now. And the odds at which we will see Zohran Mamdani win in this election have gone up quite tremendously. You can even see it in Polymarket. Now, I don't often reference the betting markets, but the reason I do it is to show you that in terms of perception of the race, it matches and tracks exactly with the data we are seeing in the race. When this race was initially thrown out into the fray, before Trump was president in January, when people knew that Cuomo was probably going to run, he had not yet announced, but it was at that point where we largely knew. Over time, Mamdani held about 7.8% of a chance of winning, but he was certainly not the frontrunner and nowhere near a definitive second place. Everyone was hovering roughly around the same. But once Cuomo announced and started dominating in the polls, he started at around an 80% chance of victory. Today, that's all the way down to 61%. And even most recently, May 27th, 2 weeks ago, Andrew Cuomo was at a 92% chance of victory, today down to 61%, at least according to Polymarket. And that comes after this endorsement, after AOC decided that she's going to put Zohran Mamdani at the top. All of these things really in phases boiling out, you can see, that took what was Cuomo's 90% or even 82% just a week ago today down to 61%. And so I am very interested in seeing, as we navigate the next 2 weeks, less than really 11 days going into this Democratic primary, the momentum is on Zohran Mamdani's side. The momentum does say that he is on a pathway to really tightening this race. But I want to also ground us in realism here, that momentum doesn't mean everything. Remember back in the 2024 presidential election, I think a big reason why many of us missed the mark, including myself, inaccurately predicting the election, was largely because there was this conflation between momentum and actual support. And what we did find was that Kamala Harris in 2024 very clearly had the momentum for extended periods of time, that she was able to outperform where Biden was at. but coming from a point where you were on track to lose potentially less than 200 electoral votes, at least based on what some of the polling was saying, to 226 does show that you did win back some support, but not enough to win the election. And the reason I bring up 2024 isn't just to talk about momentum, although I do think it's a very relevant point. I think about New York City as an example of where Democrats have lost a lot of support across the state. New York shifted 10 points to the right. It was a massive shift, and it was one that was really shocking to many Democrats, but maybe not to many Democrats in the New York City region. Look across upstate New York. Shifts by 5 or 4 or whatever it might be, some were hovering around less than the national average. The nation shifted 6 points, 6.5% to the right. Many of these counties, 5, 6, sometimes 3 points. New York City, however, and in the surrounding areas, the Bronx, 22 points more Republican. Bergen County, 13 points more Republican, right? Manhattan, 10 points more Republican. Queens, 21 points more Republican. You have to ask why. Well, a lot of it has to do with the way that voters largely across the nation perceived Democratic governance, but specific to New York City, the way they perceived Democratic governance under Eric Adams and continued Democratic rule in this city. It gave Democrats a bad reputation, and that's largely why Eric Adams now in 2025 doesn't stand to be the next the next mayor of this city. Because this mayoral election has been largely a referendum on Eric Adams. When you take a look at even how he is polling as the individual candidate here, as the incumbent at 10, 11, 15% at maximum, it's embarrassing largely because he has this name ID. He's been elected before and he won the primary not too long ago and now just simply is not in a position where voters want to reelect him. That's where all of this question around who's going to lead New York further. Because Eric Adams and many of the other Democrats here seemingly have lost the support of many voters across the city, looking at the mayoral election, this will truly be yet again another referendum, not just on Eric Adams, but Democrats in general. What direction are people looking for Zohran Mamdani, who looks like he's taking a more progressive, more left-wing approach to city governance, or Andrew Cuomo, who's looking for, sure, a Democratic stage and set of governance, but a more centrist one that's more grounded in the way he governed across the state. This is what voters will be deciding on, as well as the fact, and the elephant in the room is that we've talked about in every video referencing Andrew Cuomo since the allegations had come out against him 4 years ago, we think about, or 3 years ago, we think about Andrew Cuomo as an entity who has been largely ridiculed and pushed out of Democratic politics, and now is coming back in a position where voters are going to make a decision as well as to whether or not they believe or forgive Andrew Cuomo in this election. That is going to be the legacy that sets, because if Andrew Cuomo wins this election in the nation's largest city, we will find that there will be a lot of questions and conversations about accountability. There will be a lot of questions about whether or not this was something that mattered to voters enough that it was a deal breaker or not. That also could be a takeaway. We will also find, too, the style of governance that Andrew Cuomo is going about, whether or not that is popular in cities like New York amongst the Democratic Party electorate. Same thing with Zohran Mamdani, right? So these are all going to be questions that will be raised and will be answered in about 11 days. But the point is, and the takeaway I want you to get from this, is that this election, which I think largely has flown under the radar for many national Democrats, holds a lot of implications beyond just two people beefing it out. This is a very competitive race and one that many people did not predict would be this competitive. It very much looks like, right now, that the progressive wing of the New York City Democratic Party is building a coalition. Will that be enough to defeat the former governor? Who knows? But the race is a lot closer than it really has ever been. For the first time, Mamdani's leading in the poll, and the data is showing that from the point earlier on this year, we are in a much closer race, although it is still Andrew Cuomo's race to lose. I'd keep an eye on this mayoral election because I think that there will be implications beyond just what we've already discussed as well. What happens in 2026 might depend on who's mayor in 2025. What happens with New York in 2028 might depend on who's mayor in 2025. And so these will be very much, going to be omnipresent questions and answers that we will get about New York City, pertaining to New York City, pertaining to New York, pertaining to national politics, because all of these things serve as microcosms of a broader and more national electorate, and it will be interesting to see how these candidates perform in just 11 days. The debates are under full swing, the candidates are firing up against each other, endorsements are happening, and it's going to be a very close one. Cuomo right now is the favorite, but he was a much bigger favorite a month ago, 2 weeks ago, a week ago, and the momentum is on Mamdani's side. And it will be very fascinating to see how this race ends up in just 11 short days. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server if you go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2025 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.